And we're going to open this up now to a wider discussion on really the most important issue at the heart of this forum. The past year has seen a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism around the world, including an unchecked surge of hate speech targeting Jews, particularly online. Joining us now, a very special panel of guests, among them several of the world's top officials tasked with fighting anti-Semitism at both the national and international levels. I want to welcome Ukraine's Minister of Internal Affairs, Denis Monastyrsky, Canadian Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, Dr. Erwin Kotler, OAS Commissioner to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, Fernando Lautenberg, and head of the Israeli Foreign Ministry's Bureau for World Jewish Affairs and World Religions, Shuli Davidovich. Also joining the conversation, European Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism and Fostering Jewish Life, Katerina von Schnurbein. And to lead the discussion, let's now welcome back Robert Singer, Chairman of the Center for Jewish Impact and Senior Advisor to the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement. Robert, great to have you back here. I'll turn it back over to you.
Dear friends and the panel participants and our audience tuning from all over the world, today, just a few weeks after the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre, I would like to present to you a few disturbing statistics published by European Union and some other agencies on the state of anti-Semitism in Europe and the worst crime in human history, the Holocaust, occurred less than span of a human lifetime ago. More than 80% of young European Jews say today anti-Semitism is a problem in their country. And 44% of them have themselves experienced anti-Semitic harassment. Due to this situation, about 38% of European Jews say they are considering immigration. Let us remember the Jewish population of the European Union is already estimated to be no larger than 1.5 million people, a far cry from the pre-World War II population of 9.5 million. Ukraine has long been home to one of the world's largest significant Jewish communities, which has experienced both great triumphs and horrific tragedies. I am very pleased to represent the Center for Jewish Impact and Global Anti-Semitism Movement and host this important panel discussion today, featuring many key high-level allies from different continents who are deeply committed to the Jewish people and the worldwide fight against anti-Semitism. Before we begin the panel, we will first hear remarks from the Ukraine's Minister of Internal Affairs, of Denis Monastyrsky, who will share with us what steps the Ukrainian government is taking to fight anti-Semitism in the country. Minister Monastyrsky, welcome. Маю честь представити нашого першого спікера, міністра внутрішніх справ України, пана Дениса Монастирського. Він поділиться з нами своїм баченням щодо теми антисемітизму в Україні. Будь ласка, шановний пане міністр.
Дякую вам за запрошення взяти участь у цьому важливому форумі. Маю велику приємність долучитись до відкриття цього міжнародного заходу, покликаного сприяти великій справі подальшого поглиблення українсько-єврейського порозуміння. Маю відзначити, що проведення вже третього за ліком Київського єврейського форуму свідчить про актуальність існування такого формату, який збирає до гурту владу, громадськість, представників експертного середовища, релігійних діячів, бізнес та багато інших з України та за кордону. Всіх, кому не байдужі питання українсько-єврейського діалогу. Адже це нагода поділитися своїми поглядами на сьогодення і розвиток юдейської спільноти, боротьби з антисемітизмом, збереження пам'яті про Голокост, вшанування жертв Бабиного Яру тощо. Як міністр внутрішніх справ України хотів би приділити увагу трьом аспектам, що лежать в полі зору МВС України. Перше і ключове – це антисемітизм. Хочу впевнено сказати, цьому явищу в Україні місця немає і не буде. Система МВС, до якої входить Національна поліція, Національна гвардія, Державна служба надзвичайних ситуацій, прикордонники та міграційна служба докладає максимум зусиль для недопущення будь-яких маніпуляцій, спроб розбрату суспільства на основі національних особливостей чи віросповідання, сіяння ворожнечі через суб'єктивне трактування історичного минулого чи пропаганди новітніх штучних гіпотез міжетнічної ненависті. Ми добре розуміємо, що подібні суспільні прояви печерного невігластва є все ще живучими і доволі небезпечними, здатними стати надзвичайно серйозною гібридною зброєю у проведенні ворожих спеціальних інформаційних операцій проти нашої держави. Як свідчить статистика, за 11 місяців цього року в Україні відкрито 10 кримінальних проваджень за фактом вчинення таких дій. Більшість таких правопорушень пов'язані зі звичайним хуліганством, але не є проявами ненависті. У більшості з цих проваджень фігурантам повідомлено про підозру. Проводяться необхідні подальші слідчі дії для притягнення осіб до відповідальності. Більшість цих справ знаходяться на особистому контролі керівництва Національної поліції, і стан їх розслідування регулярно перевіряється. Крім того, ведеться послідовна робота над профілактикою та запобіганням вчинення такого роду протиправних дій. Наше міністерство працює прозоро і відкрито. За попередньо досягненою домовленістю ми щомісяця обмінюємося усією важливою інформацією щодо виявлених проявів антисемітизму з Єврейською конфедерацією України і налаштовані на продовження такого співробітництва. Друге. Ми всі чудово знаємо, що в 18 столітті в Україні виникла релігійна течія юдаїзму – хасидизм. Засадничим принципом духовних переконань хасидів є паломництво до могил їхнього духовного наставника. Популярними місцями хасидського паломництва в Україні, крім найвідоміших Умані й Меджибожа, є також Мукачево, Белз, Бердичів, Браслав, Гадяч, Сагдгора. Традиційно щороку в період Рош-Кашана відбувається масштабне паломництво братславських хасидів до могили цадіха Нахмана в місті Умань. Гарантувати проведення цього заходу в умовах безпеки та порядку – надзвичайно важливе завдання для нас. МВС України щоразу виділяє значну кількість правоохоронців, військовослужбовців та рятувальників для належного супроводження цього заходу. Цього року в Україну прибуло близько 30 тисяч вірян з різних країн світу. Усі заходи були проведені на високому рівні. В цьому нам також допомагають наші колеги з держави Ізраїль, надсилаючи в придані сили поліцейських та рятувальників безпосередньо з Ізраїля. Ми щиро вдячні за таку плідну взаємодію. Третє і не менш важливе питання, над яким міністерство працює останні кілька років, є подолання проблемних явищ в імплементації українсько-ізраїльської угоди про безвізові поїздки громадян, що була підписана між Кабінетом міністрів України та урядом держави Ізраїль у 2010 році. Йдеться про значну кількість відмов громадянам України у перетинанні державного кордону держави Ізраїль, так і про недопуск окремих громадян Ізраїлю при в'їзді до нашої країни. З огляду на пандемію COVID-19 та без запровадження обмежень на перетин кордону Ізраїлю та України іноземцями, у 2020-2021 роках згадане питання тимчасово втратило свою гостроту. Однак з відновленням подорожей подібні ситуації можуть знову мати місце. Неодноразові спроби Міністерства внутрішніх справ врегулювати наявну проблему шляхом проведення міжвідомчих нарад та ініціювання окремих рішень до успіху поки що не призвели. Тому до вирішення цієї проблеми пропоную підійти комплексно, як на рівні правоохоронних органів, експертних та політичних кіл. Наше завдання – виробити такий механізм, який був би ефективним та влаштовував обидві сторони. Українці та євреї живуть пліч-опліч на українських землях уже майже 2000 років. Нарізно і спільно вони сплели полотно культурної, мовної і історичної спадщини сучасної України. Тривалі періоди мирного співіснування переривалися роками трагедій, які розділяли людей різними доленосними переживаннями і суперечливими наративами. Врешті-решт, обидва народи зуміли відновити свою державність, на алтар якої лягли роки жертовної боротьби найкращих наших представників. Сучасні дружні держави Україна та Ізраїль схожі своїм цивілізаційним вибором та продовженням боротьби за існування. Адже не випадково Ізраїль став однією з перших країн, які визнали Україну як незалежну державу і встановив з нею дипломатичні відносини. Таким чином склалось так, що діалог між етнічними українцями та євреями переріс у діалог між двома націями, які у ХХ столітті набули власної державності. Скажу без перебільшення, для дещо молодшої в сучасному вимірі України історія відновленого Ізраїля є красномовним прикладом того, як виборювати, досягати, будувати і зберігати державну незалежність. Передумову для величі і свободи будь-якої нації. Глибоко переконаний, що шляхом підтримки одне одного на міжнародній арені поглиблені розуміння широти, складності та різноманітності українсько-єврейських відносин протягом століть, збереження вільного безвізового режиму подорожей, нам судилось будувати взаємовигідне і процвітаюче майбутнє дорогих нам України та Ізраїлю. Користаємось цією нагодою. Дякую вам за увагу.
Дякую, пане Minister, and thank you so much. And obviously, as you said, there are over 1,000 years of joint history of Jewish people in Ukraine. And now to the panel. I'll switch back to English. And I'll start with Shuli Davidovich, the head of Israeli Foreign Ministry Bureau for World Jewish Affairs and World Religions. Mrs. Davidovich, what role must the Israeli government play in the global fight against anti-Semitism?
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you very much for inviting me and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to attend such a timely and important forum. We appreciate very much what the Ukraine government is doing to promote the fight against anti-Semitism and Holocaust remembrance. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel is leading the efforts of the Israeli efforts to unite and to join hands in this global challenge. With the unique presence in 180 cities, capitals, and other cities around the world via our embassies and consulates, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs is working together with different governments, parliaments, local authorities, civil societies, heads of churches and other religions, rectors of universities, and many others, really to fight this global challenge, whether it comes from the right, from the left, from the Muslim communities. One of our main tools is, of course, and maybe the most important one, is the IRA definition of defining anti-Semitism, which is a tool how to bring to justice those who perpetrate and act in an anti-Semitic way. And there are many manifestations of anti-Semitism today. So what the Israeli government is doing, first of all, as I said, talking to other governments. I have here together other representatives of other governments, and of course the EU and other international organizations. We are sharing the same table. We are sharing the same tools. We are united in the fight. We hold annual dialogues. We talk together to the big technology societies and organizations and companies in order to take off some hate speech which spread globally.
Thank you, Shuli, and good luck in your new position, and I'm sure you'll do a fantastic job for all of us. My next question is to an old friend, Canadian Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism, Dr. Irvin Kotler. Mr. Kotler, first of all, congratulations on your recent reappointment as Canada's Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism. I know you have developed a multi-point action plan for fighting anti-Semitism. Can you elaborate on the details of this initiative and what makes it so unique?
Thank you, Robert. It's good to see you and to participate in this Kyiv Jewish Forum on the subject of anti-Semitism and hate speech, which is as timely as it is necessary. For anti-Semitism is not only the oldest and longest, most enduring and most virulent of hatreds. It is, as Ahmed Shahid pointed out in his landmark report on anti-Semitism to the United Nations, it is toxic to democracies. It is an assault on our common humanities, and it is, in effect, the canary in the mine shaft of global evil today. And we have been witnessing in Canada an alarming rise in hate speech, both online and offline. And that reached a tipping point in the Hamas war, where Jews were threatened and targeted in their neighborhoods and in the streets, on the campuses and in their communities, where synagogues were torched, Holocaust memorials defaced, cemeteries desecrated, Jewish institutions vandalized, the whole resulting, in terms of empirical data, in the largest rise of anti-Semitic hate crimes ever. By May 2021, we had reached the level of hate crimes for all of 2020, which had been the highest level ever. So accordingly, and this goes directly now to your question, the Canadian government convened the first ever national summit to combat anti-Semitism. Whereas Special Envoy, I shared a 10-point action plan to combat anti-Semitism, and this was followed by express country pledges that the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, made on behalf of Canada at the Malmo International Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. And let me now just identify in a series of one-liners what that action plan and country pledges include. Number one, the enhancing of the teaching of the Holocaust, but also the teaching about anti-Semitism across generational lines. Number two, combating the alarming rise in Holocaust distortion and joining together with IRA, UNESCO in the Protect the Facts campaign. Number three, enhancing the adoption and implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, which is not only the most authoritative and comprehensive and international definition we have, but what is not so well known, it is the most representative. It was democratically adopted over a 15-year period by governments, intergovernmental bodies, parliaments, civil society leaders, scholars, and the like. So we have here a democratically adopted definition that was transparently adopted over a 15-year period. Number four, the combating of hate crimes through the 4 Ps, as we call it: the prevention of such hate crimes to begin with, the protection of the targeted victims, the prosecution of the perpetrators, and partnerships between federal, provincial, municipal governments, and civil society. Number 5, combating the alarming, indeed incendiary rise of hate speech on the social media. And the Canadian Parliament and the Canadian government have initiated legislation in that regard, which I hope will be adopted in 2022. Number 6, a zero tolerance policy with respect to hate speech. That means not an anti-Semitism. That means not only calling out anti-Semitism in the other's political party, but calling it out in one's own political party, and to guard against the weaponization of anti-Semitism for partisan political purposes. This must be an all-party, all civil society involvement. Number 7, the importance of allyship, where targeted minorities work in concert together to combat anti-Semitism. Number 8, combating the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values. I'm referring to the laundering of anti-Semitism under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, and even under the very struggle against racism itself, where Jews are held out to be, for example, part of the white oppressor class, or held out to be apologists for the white oppressor regime, Israel, in the Middle East. So these kinds of stereotypical anti-Semitic dynamics must be combated. And finally, the combating of hate speech, the combating of anti-Semitism cannot be the responsibility of the Jewish community alone, nor can it be the responsibility of one state alone. It must be the collective responsibility of governments, of parliaments, of civil society, and the like. In a word, this is a global threat, as I said, an assault on our common humanity, a threat and toxic to all democracies, and it requires a global response and a global action plan, and we look forward to being part of this under your leadership, Robert, and the actions of those joining us on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erwin. Thank you for this systematic approach. And obviously, having somebody at your statue in Helm in Canada is extremely important. Not forgetting that there are at least well over 1 million former Ukrainians who live today in Canada. And this connection to Ukraine and to Kyiv Forum is extremely important. And now let's go to OAS, Organization of American States, Commissioner to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism. Another friend, Fernando Lottenberg. Mr. Lottenberg, your position of Commissioner to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism for the Organization of American States is a new one. Tell us a bit about why creating this role was necessary and what is your mission there?
Okay, Robert, thank you for your invitation, and my friends, Mr. Schnurbein, Mr. Kotler, Mrs. Davidovich, it's a pleasure to be with you. When I was invited to this meeting, I said I could not decline an invitation coming from the city where my grandmother was born. So even virtually, it's a pleasure and an honor to be in Kyiv with you. First of all, Robert, let me explain a little bit about the OAS, that it's the world's oldest regional organization, dating back to the International Conference of American States, which was held in Washington, D.C. in 1889 to 1890. And that meeting approved the establishment of the International Union of the American Republics. And later on, in 1948, already after the Second World War, we have the current format of the OAS that came into being with its charter signed in Bogota, Colombia. And its pillars are democracy, human rights, security, and development. What has a lot to do with the approach that we intend to give to this mission that was designed by Secretary General Luis Almagro, because he believes the American continent and its main political organization is already ripe to have a function like this, which has already its pairs in the European Union and countries like Canada and United States, OSCE, and other organizations. And he asked me especially to foster, as Professor Kotler said, the most important and relevant definition of anti-Semitism in the Americas in its 35 countries which integrate the organization, which is the IRA definition. Not as a binding definition, not as a legal instrument, but something operational that can help people and authorities and the press to identify when we are facing anti-Semitism. And we have seen in the Americas, as Professor Kotler mentioned in Canada, the same issues in many other countries. It has to do, first of all, with the traditional anti-Semitism that comes from the right, the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis that we have seen in Charlottesville with the march when they were saying Jews would not replace us, or in Pittsburgh with the shooting of 11 people at the synagogue Tree of Life 3 years ago. We had other incidents in the continent. I'd like to mention especially the EMEA and the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in 94 and 92, with an expression of the Islamic fundamentalist anti-Semitism in our region. And we have also seen coming from the far left during the conflicts with Israel and Hamas, demonstrations saying that Israel is an apartheid state and the Star of David is the same thing as a swastika. This happened just before my window in this neighborhood in São Paulo. And as Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt said during the ADL meeting, Never Is Now, slowly but surely the temperature is rising. There are occasional storms, but too often people choose to ignore the signs and deny that there is a pattern. But by all measures, the metaphorical temperature is climbing, the conditions worsening, and this situation threatens to upend life as we know it. So even if we are dealing with the old tropes that came back during the pandemics, already mentioned by Professor Kotler, that the Jews own the pharmaceutical companies, that, for instance, I was a witness in a lawsuit 2 weeks ago here in Brazil when a journalist published in his Facebook page that no Israelis were contaminated by COVID because they introduced it to the world. I even wrote an article 1 year ago in a Brazilian weekly magazine called The Virus of Prejudice. And we have seen recently in a few countries, more in Europe than in the Americas, anti-vaxxers wearing yellow stars in a preposterous comparison to Holocaust victims. And as I said, in the other side of the spectrum, the new face of the anti-Semitism as a demonization of the state of Israel and putting it as a racist or endeavor, as it's mentioned in the IRA. So I think we have seen in a few countries also good news. It's not only bad news. And I'd like to share with you some things that have happened in Brazil during these last months. We produced a guide to identify hate speech with the help of a law school here in São Paulo, which aims to help police officers, prosecutors, and judges to characterize and sanction anti-Semitism. We have been closer to social providers such as YouTube and TikTok to have the Jewish organizations recognized as trusted flaggers, identifying and reporting anti-Semitic posts in order to have them monitored and removed with a fast-track mechanism. The Brazilian Supreme Court 3 weeks ago equated racial insult to racism, which has a more severe treatment and legal sanctions. Brazil was accepted as an observer member of the IHRA, and a bill also, as it happens in Canada, is being debated at the Brazilian House of Representatives. We hope that it's approved also even this year or the beginning of next year to regulate social media and fake news. And I believe that in this case that we should draw our attention to find a way to balance self-regulation by the social providers with legal regulation by the public administration, by the governments, in order, and with the courts decisions to find a new approach to stop the spreading of the hate speech in which anti-Semitism goes along. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. And it's good to know that in São Paulo we have such a prominent Jewish leader of Ukrainian descent, and it's another connection to this forum. Katerina, it's great to see you again. My first question for you is how to coordinate the pan-European fight against anti-Semitism at the EU level when each country has different domestic policies on this issue.
Hi, Robert. It's good to see you and all the other discussants indeed. Yes, it is a challenge. And I think it is a challenge with regards to all EU policy because we are a very diverse continent. But I believe we are really united when it comes to anti-Semitism. We understand very well on European level that we can do a lot, but unless it trickles down and it is embraced and echoed by the member states of the EU, by cities, by civil society, actually we will not achieve the goal, which is at the heart of this strategy, for Jews to see a future for themselves and for their children here in Europe. So for us, it is key to work together closely with the member states and the national authorities to work with the Jewish communities in order to make sure that we work also in their interest and with regards to their necessities and their ideas, and to make sure that the activities that we have and the initiatives that are part of this strategy actually serve the purpose. There are over 70 initiatives, and we pledged as European Union at Malmö and President von der Leyen herself, 70 different initiatives, some of them on European level and others on national level. And I think it's this interplay that actually helps us, each in our own competences, to move forward. For example, when it comes to hate speech online, the EU has a clear competence. There is a legal framework which, for example, criminalizes Holocaust denial and trivialization. We have now started infringement procedures with regards to those member states who have not yet implemented this piece of legislation correctly. But then it is, of course, once it is implemented on national level, for the member states to ensure that there is also proper prosecution of haters online and offline, to also against those who spread Holocaust denial or trivialization, and that these are being brought to justice. So it's really the connection between the two, and even further down levels to the local and the city level, that can make us successful. I believe it's also important to use the existing structures when it comes to uniting the European countries on European level. For example, there have been 2 council conclusions in 2018 and 2020 that are very clear with regards to pushing back on anti-Semitism, where member states already pledged to have national strategies on anti-Semitism. And I believe with this European strategy, there is a good example also in terms of structures and the different areas that need to be covered. Security is a responsibility above all for member states, and the security of Jewish communities must be in the interest of the state, just as any other for any other citizen. And so we on European level can support it, for example, with different projects, also intercommunal projects, but it is for the member states to ensure that Jewish premises and Jewish communities are secure, and that the funding for these measures does not rest with the community. The European Commission based this strategy very strongly on the IRA definition, which has been mentioned before, and we encourage member states to also adopt it. And in order to support its use, we have, together with the IRA, issued this year a handbook on the practical use of the IRA definition. So, it's really this interplay, I think, that helps us to advance on the various levels.
Thank you, Katerina. And as you said, the key is to work together both on European level and on a global level. And the vast experience of people sitting on this panel and presenting on this panel is absolutely amazing. And the way that you succeed to work on a global level and exchange the best practices is obviously the right thing and the right direction. I would like to go back to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, to Mrs. Davidovich. What are the most troubling contemporary anti-Semitic trends worldwide from Israel's perspective?
So you rightly said, Robert, that there are a number of troubling trends. We can't speak on one only. There is, of course, the trend of anti-Semitism that comes from the far right. We hear different politicians speaking in different ways. We see anti-Semitic activities that come from the right. Just now, as you rightly described in the beginning of our panel, that there were a number of anti-Semitic attacks. Now in the days of Hanukkah in East Europe, in the US and in other places. Another very troubling trend is anti-Semitism that comes from the right, from the far or extreme left, where we see normalization of hate speech, where even politicians use language that normalize anti-Israeli activities or anti-Israeli sentiments that really is an anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish manifestation. Of course, there is also anti-Semitism that comes from the Muslim world. We hear imams. Of course, we know activities such of the Qatar government that brings money to campuses and other places. We see a worrying trend of Holocaust distortion and disrespect, and we see a very sharp rise in hate speech in the different social media outlets, as Irving said, and also Fernando. One of the importance of the ARA definition is the fact that we cannot tolerate any hate speech, and we cannot tolerate any anti-Israeli activity or anti-Semitism that actually is a different manifestation of Jew hatred. And when we hear different politicians talking about Israel as an apartheid state, that after that is translated to attacks against Jews around the world. This is something that is extremely worrying, and we need to work together against it. One other very worrying trend is, and maybe the most poisoning environment today, is in the campuses, where Jewish students on a daily basis are being attacked because they are Jews, because they have relatives in Israel, because they identify with the state of Israel. Of course, we saw it in May when there was the front and the violence in the south. And not only Jewish students told us, we cannot identify with Israel, we cannot write things in social media in favor of Israel, because not only our peers in the academia will attack us, but also our professors in the universities, and they might hurt our scores and grades, and they are afraid of talking Hebrew and wearing Magen David, and telling that they are Jews on the campuses. We saw some activities of unions of different universities, such as in Duke University or in Toronto University. In Toronto University, for example, the union have decided that kosher food cannot be brought into the campus unless it does not have any contact with Israeli companies. So it's not only anti-Israeli activity, it's really anti or Jewish hatred activities. These are only some examples, and for that we really need a united effort here. If we want to take off any kind of anti-Semitic activities in the social media, it's not only those who read and see those kind of manifestation, but it's the Israeli government, it's the government of Canada, it's the governments of Latin American countries, this is the EU. We all need to have a joint conversation with the social media. Now, Katerina was talking about security of Jewish people. It's not only today security of Jewish institutions, schools, and synagogues, etc. We're talking about security of Jewish people in the social media, that people are, young men and women are attacked on the social media only because they are Jews and only because they are associate themselves with Israel. And this is something that all of us should not tolerate, and we should work together. So of course, there are also some positive activities and positive trends. But unfortunately, if FBI figures show that today one out of three Jews in America and elsewhere feels unsecure and was attacked in a different ways of anti-Semitism. It means that the world is not safe today to be Jewish, and we need to work together on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Shuli. And taking from here to Canada, Professor Kotler, with your decades-long experience in the field of fighting anti-Semitism, which new trends of manifestations of Jew hatred pose the greatest threats?
Okay, I'll just share with you just some trends that I find most disconcerting. The first is what I would call the mainstreaming, the normalization, the legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture, the absence of outrage underpinned by indifference and inaction. The second has been the phenomenon of this toxicity in the campus culture, and Julie has mentioned that, but this is something that we find is metastasizing in the campus culture, and that underpins the overall normalization in the culture as a whole. The third thing is the globalization phenomenon. In other words, the anti-Semitism that we are witnessing today is not only globalized, but what happens, for example, in London and Paris, not only reverberates in Montreal and Toronto, but is replicated in Montreal and Toronto. For example, when you had a convoy that went through the streets of London, England, saying, "F the Jews will rape your daughters," you had a similar convoy going through streets in Canada saying the same things. So you had not only the globalization phenomenon, but the orchestration of it in international terms. A fourth dynamic is the marginalization of the combating of anti-Semitism within the struggle against racism itself. And while we must be concerned, for example, here in Canada with systemic racism against Indigenous people, Blacks, people of color, Asian, Canadians, bigotry against Muslims, what we are finding is that anti-Semitism is being marginalized in that struggle against racism. And this leads to the last point that I want to mention, and one of the more insidious ones, and that is anti-Semitism is actually laundered under the very cover of anti-racism. So not only is the struggle against racism marginalizing anti-Semitism in that struggle, but the struggle against racism is being instrumentalized with respect to incentivizing anti-Semitism. So these are the dynamics that we're witnessing here in Canada, but which have, as I say, a global connection and follow.
Thank you, Erwin. And Mr. Lautenberg, how common is Jewish hatred in the Americas? And how much influence do foreign elements such as Iran-backed Hezbollah have in spreading anti-Semitism ideology in your countries?
Well, you know, Robert, that Latin America is a continent that was formed under the wings of the counter-reform. So we had the reform in Germany and other countries in Europe, and the counter-reform based on the persecution of the so-called heretic thoughts and people was very strong in the continent. Indeed, we had in some countries of Latin America tribunals of the Inquisition who tried the so-called Judaizers, judaizantes in Spanish. And in Brazil, although we did not have tribunals, we had visitations from the Inquisition, which lasted 3 centuries. So this leaves a culture that is still felt in some parts of the continent, despite the efforts made by the Catholic Church, especially after the Vatican Council 55 years ago, is still something that perspires some traditional anti-Semitism. Regarding the Islamic fundamentalism that you mentioned, we have seen before, especially in Argentina, with the attacks against the Israeli embassy and against Temia in the 90s, its strength. And while we were at the front of the Jewish Federation of Brazil, and we have met many times, we pushed for an approval of a new anti-terrorism law that was very effective and thwarted some attempts of attack during the Olympics, which were conducted in Rio de Janeiro a few years ago. So it's not something that we see very concretely all the time, but we know they are there and they have the support and the welcoming of some of the governments in the region, especially in Venezuela, where you see a presence and an importance of Iran and Hezbollah very strong, and which cannot be explained by normal means. There is something added to their presence, and we have all to be alert all the time so that episodes like happening in Buenos Aires cannot repeat themselves in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Very disturbing. Katarina, what is the unique about the EU strategy to combat anti-Semitism and mainly foster Jewish life that makes it different from past initiatives?
Robert, I believe with this strategy, we're really turning a page. It's the first of its kind, the first ever EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, so the two together. It's a strong political statement, really the expression of the EU and its determination to put an end to anti-Semitism and to commit to a future for Jewish life in Europe. Now, we know that this hatred is age-old and it's not going to happen overnight, but very clearly the avenues are being put in place. First of all, to address anti-Semitism in all its specificities. So to recognize all forms of anti-Semitism as equally pernicious, with regards also to Israel-related anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, but also Holocaust denial and distortion, as was already mentioned. But also, I believe it's important to recognize this everyday anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that comes in casual remarks at the workplace that can be very disturbing for Jews. And then, of course, the more traditional right and left and Islamist extremist forms of anti-Semitism and how to address it always together with the member states. I would like to give you a concrete example. For example, as Shuli mentioned, anti-Semitism on campus is a real challenge. And one thing we have done now as part of this strategy is to equip the European Union of Jewish Students with a large grant for them to support projects of their affiliates in the different universities across Europe to highlight Jewish life, to address anti-Semitism, and to be visible with their activities on campus. So the strategy in that sense is very concrete. We also are determined, as we see now, a change with regards to Holocaust remembrance in the course of this strategy, which is laid out for 10 years. As survivors are passing away, and we need to adapt to a more diverse society and also a digital sphere. So all of this means that we will need new forms of remembrance, and we want to develop those together with experts and of course also the Jewish community. And again, there is funding available for this, so I think this is also important. It's not just words, it's concrete actions and the funding that is provided. For example, one initiative is a project called Where the Holocaust Happened, to show how local it was and to show in local circumstances there were houses where Jews were hidden, deportation sites, so that also today when we see these sites, and these places where today, of course, you don't necessarily see any traces, but we can be reminded of what does it mean today when we see anti-Semitism rising again, and how do we need to speak up against it. Then, of course, on a more long-term and also a broader scale is the aspect of education. So curricula is one thing, but really it is also about the training of teachers and ensuring that member states will have programs at hand to train not only the history teacher or the religious teacher, but also, the sports teacher. Everyone needs to recognize anti-Semitism and needs to be able and needs to be equipped to address it when it occurs. And in order to substantiate this and support it, we want to create a European research hub not only on the Holocaust, because that basically exists with the European Holocaust Remembrance Infrastructure since 2010, but really with regards to addressing anti-Semitism and Jewish life today, and connect the different researchers and increase research on a European level to have an applied form and a possibility for education also to draw on resources there. I think it's very important to work on this together with our partners. The strategy spells out clearly that Israel is a key partner for the EU, also in this fight, but more broadly, and that we cooperate with our international partners, those who are here and beyond, in different formats, and we really team up. I believe it's important to understand, I focused on the cooperation with the member states in my previous intervention, but it is also really important for the EU. We want to lead this fight against anti-Semitism globally in cooperation with our partners. The strategy ends with the sentence, "Europe can only prosper when its Jewish community prospers too." And I think this is really the key and the heart of what we want to see, a Jewish community that prospers in the EU.
Thank you, Katerina. And we take from this session that we have to be focused, concrete, pragmatic, programmatic, and operational. And I would like to thank all our panel participants for being here today and providing a very unique behind-the-scenes look at the many actions being taken at the national and international levels to fight anti-Semitism. It is heartening to see the serious efforts you are spearheading, and we wish you only the greatest success. And we stand ready to assist you in any way we can. Nurit, I turn the program back to you now.